US President Trump and China's President Xi, as we know, will meet on the sidelines of the G20 in Argentina in just over a week from now. And there are very few signs of any easing in tension over trade. Indeed, the rhetoric seems to be ramping up, and there's little optimism that there will be any meaningful breakthrough in the trade dispute. The verbal sparring between the two superpowers has escalated, with the failure of the APEC summit to deliver a communique and the barbed exchanges which have followed a clear measure of the gap between the two sides. This morning, the Straits Times leads, in its hard copy paper anyway, on the US claims that China has not only continued its so-called unfair trade practices, but has in fact stepped them up. They're harsh and highly critical words, indicating, I believe, that the US is not likely to adjust its position at the meeting between the two leaders. The trade war poses a risk to world growth and to individual nations, as you heard the minister just say. Only last week, Singapore's Prime Minister warned that ASEAN nations may be forced to choose sides between the US and China, and you just heard Minister Chan say the same thing. Earlier this month, former US Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson warned that if the two countries cannot reach a deal an economic iron curtain could divide the world. They're extraordinary words to use. So these predictions are dire. They have enormous ramifications for Asia and the rest of the world, and they are the subject of our first panel discussion this morning. So let me please welcome our guests who are on the stage. Dr. Wang Huiyao, founder and president of the Center of China and Globalization. Steve Okun, senior advisor, McLarty Associates. And Ruth, who's former Secretary of State at the German Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy, where she led Germany's global trade interests and EU and WTO trade negotiations. And Ruth is also on the board of Asia House. Luong, Director General of the Multilateral Trade Policy Department, the Ministry of Commerce of Vietnam, and he's heavily involved in Vietnam's negotiations on CPTPP. And Dr. Robert Koopman, Chief Economist of the World Trade Organization. Please join me in thanking our speakers. Well, thank you all for being here. A lot to talk about. There was a time, most of my career has been in journalism, where trade stories barely got a mention. They're now front page news, to use old media words. It dates me, I'm afraid. Front of the websites, all over Twitter. Trade is a core part of the global debate. Let me start with you. Firstly, this meeting next week, there's a lot of focus on it. Do you expect any breakthroughs between President Xi and President Trump?
Thank you, Chair. It's really great to come back to Singapore. As we just heard the minister talking about Singapore as such an attractive place, and it was actually my second time in 1 month. I was in the New Economy Conference Bloomberg was organized 2 weeks ago. I think it's really a great sign that President Xi and President Trump are meeting in Argentina, because it's a high-level meeting. It has been, since the telephone conversation between President Xi and President Trump. I think that both leaders are expecting this important meeting, and also that unusually they are actually having a dinner after the meeting, which. In a country, in a third country, neither U.S. or China. So I think that this is really a positive sign. I think it will really probably set the tune for a great framework, and I think that the working team that of both countries will work on that. And so hopefully that we are looking for some kind of possibility and peace, calm down of current, really the trade tariff escalation. So that's my best hope.
You're hoping, you're relatively optimistic. Steve, let me turn to you. Do you think of any breakthrough at this meeting?
No. Next question.
Could you elaborate?
First, I want to just say to my fellow Americans, I know I see a couple of you there, happy Thanksgiving. Yes. I think, growing up in Chicago, I didn't think I'd be at a UK-based organization in Singapore talking about China on Thanksgiving, but welcome to the era of Xi and Trump, right? No, there's going to be no breakthrough. And there isn't, because what I think people are missing the point is, I get all these questions all the time, right? Doesn't President Trump realize tariffs are just a tax on the U.S. consumer? Doesn't President Trump realize when he's going to stop FDI into the U.S., he's hurting U.S. business? He doesn't care. right? That's not the issue. The issue is that the U.S. has recognized that our consensus for the past 20 years or so, maybe 25 years, of accommodating and engaging China on trade and economics is over. That we can debate whether it was a failure, whether it was a mistake, whether it was the right thing to do, and it's just time to end. But that period of accommodation and engagement is over. And that is because the U.S. on the substance, read President Trump's Twitter feed. It's very important to read that, but you also need to read the substance. Right? This week, the USTR came out with a 53-page report showing that China continues, right, to violate many of its commitments to ensure that there's forced technology transfers, to engage in cyber theft and cyber crimes against the United States and U.S. businesses, to continue to block what should be lawful FDI into China. And until that changes, there isn't going to be a difference between where President Trump's rhetoric is now and where the substance is. So I don't see any framework coming into place unless the two sides start to negotiate what really needs to be negotiated. And the minister made this in his second point this morning, and he said that one of the second biggest challenge, or the second challenge that China is facing, is moving from a state-led economy to a market-driven economy. And I would urge all of you to read Made in China 2025, the Chinese document that came out, a few years ago, where China was going to say that it was going to dominate the 10 most important industries in the 21st century. That hasn't changed, and they were going to do that through state subsidies. That hasn't changed. So until there's a discussion about how China is going to transform from a state-led economy to a market-driven economy, and how the U.S. and the West and the East are going to be part of that discussion, I don't see any change happening regardless of a dinner between the two presidents in Argentina.
Okay. And Ruth, let's turn to you, because the U.S. position, or the Trump position towards Europe, has changed over the last 12 months. There was lots of tough talk on U.S. and trade issues with Europe. But now the U.S. seems to be gathering its allies around in a sort of anti- or counter-China move. What's the European reading of the Trump-China situation right now? How long will this play out?
I think the EU is realistic enough to assume that we're in a long game here. We have, and certainly my country has changed its attitude towards China trading and investing in Germany to the degree that we are more cautious. We would probably underwrite what my US colleague said, that China hasn't given way in terms of how it prevents a level playing field to come into existence, and it has also not given way in terms of all the intellectual property issues and others. However, going for full-blown out trade friction in a world that is as interdependent as ours is obviously not a very smart move. Those of us that depend on the global economy, and certainly Europe does, will have to counter the effects of those of the imbalances that will be created by a continuous trade friction and trade war. And I think our efforts should be directed towards understanding what will happen to supply chains globally, how we preserve trade efficiencies, how we preserve growth, and how we preserve a balance of interaction that we all know we benefit from. Whether we will be able, and the EU as such, I don't think currently is in a position to leverage much weight with the United States, but possibly jointly with ASEAN, the EU, Canada, perhaps Mexico, and other big trading partners will together be able, in the G20, to muster sufficient energy to tell the two countries that they need to change the way they deal with each other.
Luong, Hong Tai, let's look at the Vietnam situation. There are advantages, at least in the short term, are there not, for Vietnam and similar countries in this dispute between China and the US? How are you positioning?
Yes, of course, there have been a lot of talk about some of the ASEAN countries being there and can be beneficiary to the current frictions that are happening. But we don't think that the frictions would be good for anyone. For example, we have a recent study by the World Bank that with what's happening, and then with the US increasing the tariffs, people tend to think that Vietnam would be the beneficiary in terms of increasing our export. But the study pointed out that all the goods that Vietnam can export that are now subject to tariffs from the US, covering only about 2.3 billion US dollars. And what's worse is that the demand, either in the US, in China or as well, may be decreasing as a result of the trade friction, and that more than offset what we would gain from the friction. So like most others, we would hope that if they cannot solve all the frictions, at least we hope that by G20, we see at least people will be sitting down together to start talking. We tend to agree with some others that it is a long game, but at least we hope that in order to solve the frictions, at least people have to sit down, talking, and that's what we hope.
Okay. Robert Koopman, I do want to talk to you a little later about WTO itself, but first, the impact of the trade tensions, trade war on growth. OECD's put out a report with some quite tough warnings. I think JP Morgan put something out overnight or yesterday. It's going to hit growth, isn't it?
Yeah, so our analysis, we've already revised our trade forecast downward, but it's a revision downward. It's not a decline in trade.
Yeah.
It's slowing trade. And we think that the direct effects of the policies that have been announced so far are causing a drag on trade growth and some direct effect on economic growth in general. Our bigger concern is, as the minister pointed out, the increasing uncertainty that comes from this kind of environment. And will that uncertainty affect investment behavior and consumer behavior? And we start to see indications that investment decisions are indeed being adversely affected around the world. We hear that Chinese consumers are starting to hold back on some of their consumption growth. Those kinds of things would end up having much bigger effects on overall economic growth and trade growth than just the direct effects of the policies. I think our bigger concern is if this current trade conflict truly becomes a world where we have non-cooperative trade outcomes, then the effects are very, very large, much larger than what the World Bank, IMF, the WTO has been saying. And that adversely affects everybody. The current skirmishes, we do think, will have some indirect positive spillovers to other countries as supply chains realign, and we do see some of that. It was happening anyway, by the way. Outward FDI, as was mentioned, from China was growing pretty significantly. And supply chains are very flexible in this modern world of technology. They do need to have good rules, regulations, frameworks to be able to adjust within. So that uncertainty could start spilling over into that area. That could cause big negative effects on adjustment.
So Steve Okun, the global economic consequences, not just of the slowdown in trade, but the increased uncertainty and contraction in consumer demand, pretty dire. So is that a factor being built into US policy, or is the US just determined to charge through and drive change?
Well, I think there's a consensus that accommodate and engage when it comes to China is over. The question of what's next, does it become contain and isolate, or is it something less than contain and isolate, is what's going to lead to the consequences, the dire consequences that could happen if the U.S. were to really go forward with a contain and isolate. And I think that is where you're having the real debate in Washington right now. You're having the real debate in the Trump administration, and you see the Navarro and Lighthisers and Kudlows and and Pence all engaged in this. I mean, I think the hopeful aspect, certainly the hopeful aspect from the business community, is that we come to something less than contain and isolate. I mean, as the business community, we would say the number one mistake the Trump administration made when it came to its China policy was pulling out of CPTPP on day 3 of the administration. The business community still urges the U.S. to come back. We urge the U.S. to be doing more. The U.S. is trying to do more in integration. I mean, the BUILD Act, partially in response to BRI bringing $60 billion in is all of that. So I'm not as pessimistic, and I'm hopeful that there can be an accommodation between the U.S. and China, that China recognizes that it does need to move to more of a free market economy. It has to do so within its reality, but it does need to move in that direction. That the old days of basically Boeings and beans is going to end, where China commits to buying Boeings and soybeans, and the trade deficit comes down for a year or two, and everything's going to be fine. I think those days are over. So we're in a period of volatility, but I don't think it's going to be a dire end.
Okay. Dr. Wang, do you get any sense from Beijing that China is looking at making the adjustments to the so-called unfair trade practices, that it will give some ground? Because clearly the US is asking for concessions.
Yes, I think that it's a really great debate. Also, it serves as a wake-up call to both countries and the world as well. I think, first of all, this year is actually happened to be the 40 years anniversary of China opening up. And also, it's the 40 years anniversary of China-US diplomatic ties established. So in 1979, when Deng Xiaoping just November, when he finished the 11th, third plan of 11th Congress, Party Congress, next month he went to the United States in January and established diplomatic ties. So you see, the opening actually was quite open to U.S., to the Western world. It's really great for the last 4 decades. China has achieved enormously, all the multinationals in China, Fortune 500 in China, and U.S. company in China. Now, Apple, GM, Ford, and those big multinationals. GM actually, Ford is selling more cars in China than in the United States. Let's talk about some statistics. I think China is trying to make a lot of progress. Of course, China joined WTO, and WTO allowed China as a developing country status. Of course, that, for the last 70 years, China has grown, really developed. And then now I think the problem is that maybe we need to reform WTO. And also the other thing is that I would say that the business companies, particularly from the US, have made enormous inroads in China. They have actually, every year, they make about 500 billion revenues, $500 billion US dollar revenue in China. The trade deficit is only 370 billion. It's much larger than the trade deficit. Again, this is also a tri-party issue because President Trump, put tariffs on China, but they're actually hurting most of the U.S. companies. Half of the China export was really made by the, U.S. companies. Beidou products. All this. I mean, a good example is that. When President Trump announced tariff reduction, Apple announced they're going to wire back, repatriate $250 billion. They make $50 billion a year in China. So I think, same is true probably for the GM, for Ford, for GE, for, Walmart, all the rest of companies. So the problem is not just China. If the U.S. company put in their money outside China, not make America great again, they should also take some responsibilities too. So I think that it's really a multifaceted issues. I think China now is just last month, this month, China put up the largest import-export in the world ever happened. 4,000 companies came, and President Xi announced that they're going to buy, China going to import 30 trillion in the next 10, 15 years. So it's enormous. And so what I see the problem is that China has also voluntarily reduced the auto tariff by half already. China has issued the credit card for the American Express, the license. China is, Tesla is setting up 100% ownership plant in China. BMW is setting a 75% control share in China. I heard something today that Daimler Chrysler is also doing something. So there's a lot of happening. China is still actually making progress, but maybe not enough as U.S. expected. But that's precisely, I think, we need to talk. President Xi is willing to talk and Trump is talk. And that's probably the solution.
So your sense is that there is a willingness in China to make concessions, but it's the pace at which those concessions can be made, which is one of the thorny issues.
I think there's a willingness of both sides to make progress. You know, if President Trump said they would like to talk and President Xi is willing to talk, it's a great sign that, the diplomatic of the head of state is really important. I mean, also business is concerned. I mean, the U.S. business just 2 weeks ago, there's 300 or 400 business people gathered in Singapore on the New Economy Conference on Bloomberg. So we're talking a whole day about China. If China is not that relevant, I mean, why everybody is so concerned? So it's already part of the global chain. If you cut this part off, it's going to really hurt the world. I mean, the booking has actually made some forecast. If there's a 10% tariff, the world economy is going to be hurt by 1 to 4%. If it's 40%, we're going to have another recession. So I think the tariff is not the way to go back. I mean, let's do the multilateral, let's do the talks and maybe WTO reforms and RCEP, CPTPP, all those things. Let's work this together on that.
CPTPP, Mr. Tai, has come up several times in this conversation already. Is it of even more strategic importance now than ever before, given the escalating tension? Is that a sense you get, because you're involved in the discussions, negotiations in CPTPP, is there a realization that that is now becoming something of a beacon of multilateralism, and it's important that not only succeeds, that it thrives?
Yes, that's, you look at the coming into force provision of the CPTPP, it says that at least 6 countries ratifying it and it become effective. Instead of the TPP, which says 2 years. The reason why is because people trying to show that yes, in all the frictions, at least we have some rules and we want to prove that the rules are working for some people. And we hope that this is something that we at least can create something as a forum for people to be engaged. So you are right that the CPTPP is something that we are trying to do in a little bit quicker because of what is happening.
And is there an appetite in the CPTPP group to add other countries, the UK, which has expressed an interest in looking at it? Is there, again, not only a willingness but enthusiasm for expanding membership?
Officially, we cannot say now because we need to wait for the UK until after March next year before they can officially engage.
But before officially.
But I think there have been a lot of people reaching out, starting talking, sensing how should we go from here. Of course, there are a lot of uncertainties now, and trade negotiations sometimes take a long time. Yeah. So many people hope that we can finish a trade agreement in a few months, for example. But to be practical, most serious trade negotiations take years rather than a few months.
And Ruth, I want to turn to the WTO and Robert Okun in just a moment, but it is in need of reform, is it not? And you dealt with the WTO in your previous role. Is there a possibility that that reform can happen quickly enough to help resolve and diffuse some of the issues that we have at the moment?
Well, we would hope that the WTO has the power, the guts, and the will to reform itself. However, knowing how international organizations work, create consensus, and push policy, it is probably a very long game, and the partners that actually drive the WTO are too disparate to create the momentum to do that. So I'd rather come down on the side of saying, let's hope that together with ASEAN, the EU, the WTO and other international organizations will form consensus around preserving the global multilateral system of fair rule and fair trade, including promoting acceptable, transparent standards, rather than hoping that the WTO is a very complex organization, will be able to reform. But all hands up for that organization to deal with the current situation.
Robert, neat segue to you. Is there an appetite within the WTO for reform?
Oh, definitely. But the appetite varies depending on the members.
Yeah.
And it is a members' discussion. I want to clarify that we on the Secretariat are member-led organizations. We provide information and analysis that helps them with their discussions. But there is, I think, a growing momentum to have a deep discussion around reform. And much of that is around issues like transparency, the notifications for subsidies, the how quick disputes are handled, what's covered in disputes. And these are substantive conversations by major players. I think it's very good. It is a question as to whether or not it will gain enough momentum that all the members will buy into it. But one other thing that's becoming more clear is that the WTO is a more flexible agreement and organization than many people perceive. And I think a lot of the perceptions are derived from post-Uruguay round discussions and negotiations in the Doha round. Much of the success of the WTO has often been like-minded countries finding ways to agree and move forward, and creating an environment where the other countries that aren't ready can join in when they are. And those kinds of discussions have started to permeate again, come back into the discussion, rather than we have to talk about everything all at once and have a big agreement, which, by the way, was not supposed to happen after the Uruguay round. We're looking at ways within the Secretariat, but members also, how to make better use of the regular committee work, where a lot of very good transparency happens. Transparency, by the way, helps contribute to certainty. And I think that's, many of the things that we do on a day-to-day basis, I think, don't necessarily rise to the public's awareness like a big negotiation, but it's still very important in that day-to-day business. Trade policy reviews, our notification systems, the kinds of discussions on standards and technical barriers at the SPS, TBT committees. There's a lot of good things that still happen. We had the trade facilitation agreement, which we think is going to have bigger net effects than removing all tariffs, if fully implemented. One last thing, if I could say, well, two things. All WTO members live in glass houses. They all have things that they should not be proud of. What I find interesting is often the debate is about trying to accuse the other side of having failures and not acknowledging your own. I think it would be much better if countries would recognize that they all have these sensitive areas, and how do you build some momentum to negotiate forward in those areas. And then, you live in a glass house, you have to find these solutions sometimes elsewhere. So learning from what's happening in other areas of negotiations and reflecting on those and potentially bringing those back to the multilateral system is a very valuable process. At least that's what many of us feel, that there's much to learn from these other negotiations that are going on. And finally, don't try to solve all your economic problems with a trade negotiation. I think one of the concerns that the US administration seems to have about China is it's got a strong and clear economic strategy for economic development. I'm not sure all of those policies involved in that strategy comply with international rules. I don't know. But maybe the US needs to think about its economic development strategy and what has worked for it historically, and has it gotten away from the kinds of things that worked for it. I mean, Minister Chen was talking about regional disparities. These are huge. And you look at the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area versus Detroit. That's not something that's necessarily trade-driven. There's an economic geography challenge that many countries face. You go to Shenzhen, China, it's not a developing city. It's a hyper-competitive, fast-growing, high-income economic region. So trade agreements are about between countries, and yet within countries we see big economic development disparities. How do you deal with those? It's not clear to me that trade agreements are the place to deal with that.
Steve Okun, the US president doesn't seem to be a big fan of the WTO. There's talk of reform, but it's likely to be slow if it happens at all. What's the outlook for the WTO from the sort of US president, US administration's perspective?
Yeah. And I want to tie into what Dr. Wang said as well, because, there's no question that China is critical to U.S. businesses. U.S. businesses are not pulling out of China. U.S. businesses have to be in China. It's going to be, if it's not already, the largest domestic market to serve. And you can't pull your factories out of China and continue to serve China. So that manufacturing is going to stay. Supply chains may shift. You may take some manufacturing that would have been exported out of China into a Vietnam or a Thailand. But that's the challenge, so you have to stay engaged in China, but how are you going to reform China? Because China needs reform. And getting to the WTO point, there's no way that Made in China 2025, with its state subsidies for all of those 10 industries, should be complying under the WTO. Now, and it might be, and that's where the reform needs to get to. And Robert mentioned the state subsidies. And so, yes, the U.S., when it talked at APEC, it said we need to see state subsidies, we need to see transparency, we need to see how we're going to tighten up the definition of non-market, non-market economies in developing countries. The U.S. is trying to do that on its own, with the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, saying that we're not going to allow you to negotiate an FTA, Canada and Mexico, with China. And so it wants the WTO to do that, but if the WTO can't reform, the U.S. is going to go, and it's going to do it on its own. And I'll just say that certainly as an American, we recognize we live in glass houses. We throw stones all the time using, the national security exemption to justify auto parts tariffs would be a stretch, if not an outright breakage of that. And then we're going to get taken to the WTO if we, the United States, do that. So we'll see what happens. So yeah, but so it goes to exactly your point. We want the WTO, but then we don't want it to tell us what to do, right? And so all of this is where the Trump administration is running up into the realities of what the business community needs and what others in government want.
Let's open up now to questions from the audience, please.
Michael, could I make one clarifying comment?
Okay, and we'll come to you, but please, yep.
Okay.
A counter from Robert here. Yeah.
Yes. People talk about, particularly I hear from the U.S., loss of sovereignty due to WTO findings. If there's an adverse finding against you in the dispute settlement process at the WTO, you do not have to change your laws. Many people just don't seem to understand that, particularly in the United States.
Okay.
That's also, I could I could add a final comment on the WTO. I think that, since Second World War, we had this Bretton Woods system, which has the U.S. led that system, which is a very multilateral approach. I think the way to get out of this trouble is that let's do the multilateral approach. Let's do another round of great trade talks at WTO, but also at, let's say, a regional platform like CPTPP,
yes,
which is already a low-hanging fruit. It has been agreed by 12 countries, 11 countries. There is on a high level of WTO is regarding the service trade. China actually have, Huawei or Xiaomi or Alibaba or Tencent. All those companies also want service going out. So we have a new level of trade protection or arrangement through this new arrangement. So I think the leadership of the world now is really trying to think out and maybe reach new senses. So I think my recommendation would be that China and the U.S. all come back to CPTPP and then talk about that, and then let's have a new round of a global multilateral agreement. Because unilaterally, bilaterally, sometimes it's not as effective as multilaterally. I remember when China joined WTO, it was a multilateral effort. And then China honored its commitment, trying to honor its commitment, and also abolish thousands of outdated rules and regulations. So the best way to do is multilateral. Is really, let's get those regional agreement and RCEP and all the CPTPP and WTO work.
Yeah.
Not to really start a unilateral approach.
Question, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Lockney Su. I'm Professor of Law at Singapore Management University. It's a terrifically interesting panel discussion. I have two questions. The first one is directed at the panel in general, and it relates to the idea of using national security. We're seeing a lot of focus in trade and investment regulations now focusing on national security. So for the businesses, they might feel helpless. How do we ensure that that doesn't become a new kind of trade barrier? I mean, there are legitimate arguments on national security, of course, but it could also be become a trade barrier in some way. My second question is directed at Director General Luong. With the entry into force soon of the CPTPP, can we look forward to some change in Vietnamese law on the data localization area? Thank you very much.
Let's start with that, and then we'll move on to national security issues. The question was to you on data.
Yes, the CPTPP agreement will come into force for Vietnam on the 14th of January instead of 30th of December like some others. And in the CPTPP agreement, there is some rules on data localization, but it is subject to an exception on national security. So linking that to the first question, so in that context, we also have a new law on cybersecurity, and we are working with the partners on the scope, also the detailed rules in that. And I can tell you that because of the CPTPP, we are now working to narrow down the scope of the cybersecurity law so that it, for example, will not be applying to financial services companies. A lot of services companies will be out of that. So the new draft has taken care of that, but we will continue to be working with some other stakeholders, in particular the international businesses, trying to define national security in the agreement in a sense that it's truly for national security purposes. Thank you.
To the broader question of national security becoming a trade barrier, it sort of is. Already, isn't it, Steve?
It is to some degree, and I mean, the U.S. has obviously, expanded, the CFIUS review process, and it's inevitable. I mean, again, when you have all of the cyber theft that's occurring, when you have cyber espionage occurring, when you have state-owned companies that can then get those secrets and then bring them in, countries are going to want to block that. So I think there is a growing legitimacy for using national security when it comes to FDI restrictions. The problem is you don't want to then call everything national security to get out of your WTO commitments, like you call steel and aluminum and autos and auto parts. If you start taking in U.S. law terms, Section 232 exemptions for that, you're going to undermine it. And so I think that's what we want to see, is where there is a growing legitimacy for taking national security into account in FDI, but it can't then become the loophole in which you can drive trucks through.
Dr. Wang.
Yeah, I think we have to ask fundamental questions. Are we better off compared with 70 years ago? I was just in Paris for the 100 years anniversary of First World and that Second World War. Are we better off 40 years ago? I think precisely because of the trade actually made the world prosperity and world interconnected. So I'm very dismayed to see that we are tightening the security, we're tightening all those measures, CFIs and European countries, inspection, so that will jeopardize the trade, will jeopardize the investment. If there's no trade, there's no investment, we'll go back to a Cold War. It will go back to the old days. Actually, China, last 40 years, opened up, has lifted 800 million people out of poverty. We don't want to make China into another North Korea or Iran or anything like that. We want to contribute. And Belt and Road is a contribution to the world. So let's talk. Let's not really tighten the security on each side and then really, if all the Chinese students in the U.S. are spies, that's the end of the world. So I don't think that we should, take that kind of. We should really be more liberalized, repair and upgrade the existing global system, and then actually looking for the better future, rather than let's really shoot each other into the Cold War. I mean, that's really another way to go. And the security is one of the reasons to. Probably the excuse to do that.
Yeah, and Ruth?
Yes, I'm not sure it's that easy. First of all, in terms of national sovereignty, I think my American colleague is right by pointing out that national security protection measures with regard to FDI has a growing legitimacy around it. I also believe that there can be a good job done in terms of defining what is national security, what is critical infrastructure, and what does it take for a national economy to preserve its productivity while staying engaged in global supply chain and in global economic activity. I also think that the WTO is certainly helpful in defining these measures, but it makes no sense as long as we cannot wrap our arms around what cyber threats we will have to face in the future and how we counteract cyber criminality or trans-border activities that are poorly understood. We will be going down the road of defining what is national security, what does it take, and how do we protect our national economies.
Robert, final word to you from the WTO's perspective.
Oh, I'm pretty boring on this. You know, there's a case at the WTO, so I really can't talk very much about it. Sorry
yes,
about
you can.
that.
Just come on, informally.
You're not being recorded.
Well, you know, I think, so without the specific issue here, I think national security is being invoked because of concerns around unlevel playing fields, right? And the way an economist and the WTO would look at this is, well, okay, what are the issues? How unlevel is the playing field, and how much is that injuring the other party, right? And then at the WTO, you try to find a way to have an equivalent withdrawal of benefits. And it's not clear to me that the national security provisions as being invoked have anything to calibrate against. So we don't really know how big of an issue is it? How much should you invoke it? And whether or not this is the appropriate kind of quantification process, or is it something existential? I think the US is arguing it's existential. That makes it very difficult then, and they've already argued that it shouldn't be tried to be settled through the WTO dispute settlement process. We see it as a very no-win situation, either way you go. We don't necessarily see it as a positive thing. So it's a political thing. Let's get a political negotiation around it, and let's solve it politically rather than try to stick it into a system that's really not designed to answer it.
Okay, thank you. Look, I'm afraid we have to leave it there because we're out of time. Fascinating conversation. We're going to take a break now and come back with a session on technology, including Kai-Fu Lee, one of the pioneers in artificial intelligence, and also then a discussion on Belt and Road, a key part of this global picture. So we start promptly at 10:30, but please thank my speakers for a fantastic conversation.